category or a meta-concept often used interchangeably with passion, feeling, affect, and other related words. And here we have an idea. As Barbara Rosenwein affirms and proves with her scholarship, historians of emotions that deal with medieval text, so as in our case, I quote, do not need to worry too much about these fine distinctions because they are anachronistic, since the term emotion is rather a convenience, a constructed term that refers to affective reactions of all sorts, intensities and durations. Thus, historians of emotion need instead to use emotion as a master category, a meta-concept, and conceive them as not being merely passive, irrational, individual, personal, and subjective occurrences, but instead, emotions are also active processes, and that's why they possess a history. We can study a history of them. Practices that are named, trained, regulated, and redirected. And emotions can also be strategies, as we will hopefully see, requiring purposes, intentionalities, directions. The question of emotion is further complicated by the different words for, and thus conceptualization of, emotion across languages. And Arabic offers, as always, I would say, offers a constellation of terms that could loosely translate the English emotions, each of course with its own semantic field. And to complicate the matter further, yes, ideas, perceptions, and naming of single emotions influence how we do emotions. That is, how we self-perceive, experience, and practice them. So here you have, let's say, some emotion words in English, and this is the same scheme, but integrated with emotions from different languages. The typical example would be Schadenfreude, in German, I'm happy for the sadness or for the disgrace of someone else, Shamata in Arabic, but then we don't have this, for instance, in Italian or in English or in French. Emotion, thus, are in part untranslatable. For a certain emotions, we don't have the right word for it, and vice versa. We have a word for an emotion that we have never thought we had experienced, or we didn't have the right word to experience it, let's say. In the field of Islamic emotions, and that's a little bit the most recent publications, emotions came to be analyzed. As you can see, these are publications from 2026. It's a blooming field also in Islamic studies, but we don't have, for instance, important introduction or a comprehensive introduction of Islamic emotions per se, rather some aspects. And just this, in the concept of emotion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which would resemble like an introduction to Islamic emotion, is written by Paul Heck, and I was yesterday a professor at Georgetown University, and I was yesterday with him presenting on the same topic. This emotional approach, however, implies some challenges. A history of emotions in early Sufi studies can fundamentally rely only on textual evidence. That's why I here put a manuscript of Ibn Abi Dunya, Kitab al-Ham wal-Huzn, which in turn happened to be frequently scant and only a small part of the oral transmissions of knowledge of the examined period. Also, another limit, emotion words have no self-evident meanings, but they need contextualization. They represent just one way, in this case the textual one, to express emotions, which is often fixed and modeled by the literary genre that vehicles such emotions. What I'm saying here, that if we open a Sufi manual, for instance, which probably wants to prescribe or proscribe some attitudes, then there will be a certain expression of emotions. But if we read some makatibat, some letters between shuyukh, for instance, we might have a different, perhaps more intimate way to express one's emotion, or perhaps not. And we would be actually tricked by the fact that the Sufi sheikh, while writing the letter, would actually know that he was writing to a higher, a wider audience than the format or the genre of the letter would let us imagine. Thus, it would be an exaggeration to state that my textual emotions analysis, as we will see it now, allows us for real to know how Sufi actually felt, and that's not what I claim. However, and I'm quote again Barbara Rosenwein's words, we can begin to know how some members of certain groups thought they and others felt, or at least thought they ought to feel, how they should feel. That is all we can know, but it's quite a lot. How much more do we know about the feelings of the people around us? So the other challenge, or the other limit, of course, is that when we talk about early Islamic emotions, we need to find a corpus of Sufi text or whatever, pious texts. In my case, I was very much interested in renunciation, so zuhd, kutub al-zuhd, and in particular, I made up this, I made up this list of early zuhd texts. We have 20 that are still extant, and much more that are not extant anymore. And then I was interested in Sufism, of course, and therefore I create a Sufi corpus. We are not going to discuss this now, but it would be lovely to actually have a discussion on the criteria and what do we mean when we talk about a Sufi corpus. So I came up with this list, and it's around 220 published works. But what is interesting is that we have also around 25 manuscripts that are very important for the history of early Sufis, but they are still there, unpublished, in some library in the Middle East, or even here in the US, and they are waiting for a good critical edition. And again, important, we have 400 plus works that are lost, and we just know their titles. It's good to have a fuller picture of what we had, right? At least even just the titles. And there is a colleague of mine, Jeremy Farrell, a postdoc in Leiden, who is preparing a book precisely on lost books in the history of Sufism. So the books that we know only by their titles or some extracts. So the method now, okay, we have some limits. We understand that we cannot know exactly how Sufi felt, but perhaps how they thought some could or ought to feel. We have a certain limited corpus. The next step would have been to create a method in a way, and I came up with this emotion word or emotion network of words to try to read these texts and try to find how and they were conceptualizing emotions in these texts. So the basic idea is to choose an emotion word that is a master emotion word. So for instance, the word that they used in predominantly to express that emotion. So for instance, sadness in English, and then create a network, a shabke of other related emotion words, quasi-synonyms, or even metaphors, expressions. And this it would look something like this in English, but then of course we need to always come back to the Arabic, and that's how it might look in Arabic. So for sure, Hosen, which is the word that they use the most, but then looking also at lexicographical works from that time, so dictionaries that were also presenting synonyms or quasi-synonyms of Hosen, integrating this shebka with different other words. So for instance, gham, ham, kamad, which is usually defined as the end of sadness, in other words, depression, and other words that are related to it. And we could do the same. Of course, then this would be a more faithful reproduction. Some words are used in a more consistent way and others are just rarer. And then we could do, of course, the same with different other emotion networks or clusters, if we want. For instance, I worked on shauq. So again, we should look at all the synonyms that we find in the same text, in lexicographical text of the same time, and that are usually quoted together in this corpus. You cannot really see the title, but when I started doing my PhD thesis was in 2018, and that's how it looked like. Basically, I would go through all these 220 texts with a pencil, different colors, and look at these Hosen, Ram, Ham, Sauda, or these kind of words. Today we have to talk and we have to think in the digital era, I guess, and here I would like to pause 1 second and to thank Antonio Musto, who was a PhD here at New York University, and who is the creator of this amazing platform called Kashaf, So basically, in this case, I'm looking at Huzn, at the root, actually, Ha, Zun, Zain, Zay, Nun. Sorry. And in a few seconds, I can see all the occurrences of Huzn in the text that are available in this digital platform. And as you can see, we're talking about 1,674 different occurrences. That said, of course, then one should come back to the text and read in order not to miss the general tone of the text, the contextualization, because these are emotion words that are, okay, outlined and taken in isolation, but then, of course, one should engage with the whole text and also see the underlying emotion that there is under a certain text. So, in this second part, in the second point, I will focus on Sufi emotions. And one could easily also ask the question, why Sufism? I answer to this question, first of all, because it was my prime interest, and secondly, because one could argue that Sufism represents an Islamic mode of being rooted in emotional experience, a combination of elements of asceticism and mysticism to foster an emotion-laden daily piety, inwardness and spiritual journey that intensified and perfected the knowledge of God. I'm here quoting Kara Mustafa, Ahmed Kara Mustafa. I posit that an emotional prism helps us explore the twofold dimensions of early Sufi life, the vertical relationship between the divine and the servants, and secondly, the horizontal interrelationship between the Sufis. So, vertically, I posit that Sufis can be read as an intimate engagement with the divine, a path involving emotional discipline and transformation of the self, by purifying negative feelings, cultivating positive ones, and navigating vices and virtues, which often carry emotional implications. The tension between good and bad feelings, like in this case, lies at the center of most conceptions of progress in Sufi training. Spiritual advancement occurs through an alternation between experiential states of constriction and expansion, qabd and bast, who eventually are emotion terms, in which unpleasant experiences are viewed as essential and therefore positive. Qabd and bast can also have they have a bodily expression of this emotion in a way. They are embodied emotions. Many of the spiritual stations and states, so still talking about this vertical relationship between the Sufi and God, many of these maqamat and aḥwāl, they also have unmistakable affective components. So in this case, we have khawf, mahabba, these are easily recognizable emotion terms. But then we have, for instance, zuhd, renunciation, which one could argue in some definition that is emotional detachment. Not be happy for anything that happens in the world, not be sad for anything that happens in the dunya. And repentance, which of course has an emotional component to it, which is regret, nadam. And yeah, longing again, shauq and so on. So even words that might at first sight not look like emotions, sometimes are defined in emotional terms. So rida, for instance, contentment with what God has decreed, is usually described as surur al-qalb, so the joy of the heart. But then there is a horizontal dimension, and the emotional approach helps us explore Sufi's interpersonal dynamics, the bond between master and disciple, the emotional ties between brothers in the path, and the relationship with those outside the Sufi circle, common believers, non-believers, political figures. Despite their spiritual ideals, we find signs of jealousy over their books, anger toward one another, envy between rival masters or among students, not so saintly fear of being forgotten, and anxiety about growing older. So in this corpus of Sufi texts, we also find very common, let's say, emotions of everyday life, not so saintly, not so godly. And as we shall see, emotional strategies reinforced group identity, and that's one of my main claims. Sufis were expected to feel more fear of God, more sadness at separation, more compassion. Emotional depth marked authenticity, and early manuals constantly prescribed how a Sufi ought to feel. So in this third part, I would like to share some observation that stem from my work, especially on sadness and longing. So probably the example will be mostly on huzn and shawq, but I hope we can open this up in the questions to other emotions. So the first observation that I found is that, as we said, being emotion a meta concept, and since in these pre-modern Islamic works they were not using this category, what we would call today emotions is a mix of aḥwāl, for sure, as we have seen, mahabba, khawf, rida, and so on. Some maqamat with an emotional component, sabr, for instance, which also is close to resilience and rather than patient. And then, in some ways, emotions are discussed under the category or label of ādāb and akhlāq. So how should I behave? What should I feel towards that person? So they're very close to what we would call today virtuous emotions. So emotions related to virtue. And that's why important Sufi manuals sometimes talk about khawf, for instance, or huzn as fadila, so as virtue. Rather than an emotion. The other observation is that although they do not use this category, they discuss emotion at length. So important example would be al-Muhasibi, of course, much this proto-Sufi or early intellectual figure who from Basra to Baghdad, who was much interested in the nafs, in the ilm al-nafs, so in a sort of proto-psychology, in what the nafs would feel. And that's why he has very long passages on different emotions, discussing the truthfulness of these feelings. Why are you feeling ashamed? In which way are you feeling that? Is it godly shame or ungodly shame? So they would really inspect the intentionality of this emotion. And does not come as a surprise, because many numerous Sufi stories, sayings, narrations in which emotions are performed are followed by a comment, an interpretation. Why are you angry? What made you sad? What kind of yearning for God are you expressing in this qawl, for instance? What is this envy that you're feeling? So emotion should always be interpreted, especially if you want to teach them, like in the case of As-Sulami, who is this Sheikh Master and historian of Sufism, who receives Q&A from Mecca, some questions from Mecca from disciples, and most of them are about emotions. I feel sad and I don't know why. How is that? Ya Sheikh, what should I do? And then he would go and look into the causes of sadness and try to divide what is godly and what is not godly, what is positive sadness and what is self-deceptive sadness. To be sure to love what God loves and hate what God hates, again in emotional term a certain ethics here, a very important Sufi leitmotif, the Sufi should inspect the nature of his emotions. At-Tirmidhi, another important figure in his ādāb al-nafs, so on the manners of the soul, would affirm, how could you know what the prophets were crying or grieving for? What was their concern in misfortunes? What was their joy and what caused it? Maybe some joys are praiseworthy and you don't know that. And maybe some sorrows are praiseworthy in this world and in the hereafter. Weeping, for instance, is of 7 or more kinds, and each has a different object from the other. Do you distinguish them well? Did you reach such high spiritual dwelling? So emotion, in all these writings, are interpreted and analyzed. And as we said, Arabic does not lack terms for emotions. This is an interesting Sufi work, maybe a little, not so well known, Kitab al-Furuq by Tirmidhi. It's basically a dictionary where Tirmidhi tried to prove that in Arabic there is no synonymity. So let's say it inscribed itself in the whole lexicographical tradition of the time, but with a Sufi twist. So that's why many of these entries have emotional components. So it tries, for instance, to differentiate. So all the chapters are bab al-farq bayna kaza wa kaza. Bab al-farq bayna kaza. So in this case, it tries to differentiate bayna sadness or regret. So al-huzn wa nadam. So it would analyze these emotions in depth and try to give an idea why they're different. Or friendly reproach and mutual anger, positive or benign envy and positive emulation, and so on. So it would have a particularly precise way to explore these emotion words. And this, if you want, is inserted in the general Sufi push at that time to explain Sufi terms, mustalahat Sufiya. Why so? Because, well, they were common words, but used with a spiritual meaning, with a spiritual underpinning. So, again, they would talk about huzn, but the huzn they are thinking about is perhaps different from what a common believer would understand. Perhaps the most interesting meta-reflection, so as I said, they don't really use the category of emotions, but I believe the most interesting meta-reflection on Sufi emotions comes again from at-Tirmidhi, and I would like to read this quote together. So it talks about things rather than emotions, ashya. And it defines ādāb of religion as to arrange each of these things, and we will see that he's talking about emotion, that God has set in your body in its proper place, as he has appointed. So it's like some sort of, we would call it today, emotional hygiene, in a way, to know what you're feeling and put your emotion in the right place in your body. So within your body has placed various things, among them anger, compassion, mercy, desire, longing, and fear. When any of these things stirs within you, you are not to be blamed for it simply arising. So if you feel an emotion, you're not to be blamed or praised. The point is, you are blamed and praised for how you use it when it arises. For he did not place anger in you so that you might use it wherever you please. Instead, when you see disobedience, you employ the anger placed within you for that purpose. You should not become angry in such a way that you and yourself fall into sin. If you act in this way, you have kept anger in the place where it was put. So if you grow angry for God's sake. So, in other words, is again trying to, let's say, analyze what his feelings, his emotions, and try to give them the right intentionality. This is, of course, a divine intention. To hate what God's hate and love what God's love. A question I had in mind when working on Sufi emotion, another observation was, how are they different from Quranic patterns? Since the Quran is, of course, the mold of Islamic emotions in general. Well, first of all, let's pause on Quranic emotions. Quranic emotions have been studied, actually, in Islamic studies by Professor Karen Bauer, for instance, among others, who shows how resonances, plots, allusions, references mold the reader's emotional expectations. I once again take the example of sadness. The emotion word huzn appears around 30 times in the Quran, and one can easily trace a consolation theme, consolatio. Do not be sad, la tahzanu. Out of these 40 occurrences, around 20 links sadness to fear. So do not be afraid and do not be sad. And that's why the reader would expect or would have in mind this resonance. In Sufism, I propose that just as Paul Nubia described the Sufis' deep engagement with the Quran as Quranization of memory, one may also speak of a Quranization of emotions. Sufis sought to align their feelings with Quranic emotional models, imitating the prophets and reproducing the emotional patterns and sentiments expressed in the Quran. So the easy example would be that they would take prophets as emotional prototypes. So Musa is the yearning figure, yearning for the vision of God, of course. So the vision related to Shawq. Dawood would be the poetry psalm composer who expressed again his longing for God, but with a more sorrowful tone, often portrayed in weeping. Yaqub would be the mahzun par excellence, given the story, his story with the son Yusuf. And Isa would be the prototype of emotional detachment, zuhd. So these are in line with Quranic emotional patterns. There is no real difference between Quranic emotional patterns and Sufi emotional patterns, but we do have some, I call it Quranic with a twist. So for instance, as I said, Sufi tried to make sense of different kinds of huzn that were not present in the Quran, like huzn as a virtue that purifies the heart, godly sadness as an expression of attentiveness. So basically the believer feels that he is nothing compared to God and he is therefore in a state of sorrowfulness. And then there are, and they are very interesting to me at least, some Sufi mustalahat, which are emotion terms, which are not Quranic. And some of them steer the important debate. So for instance, the use of ishq, of course, so this passionate love or eros to talk about the relationship between the believer and God. So if God didn't choose this word and he used instead mahabba, why should we use ishq to talk about this relationship we feel? But also other words that didn't really steer much attention. So for instance, shawq, again, he's used as a mustalah, a very important Sufi term, but it's not a Quranic term. And therefore there were some debates around this word. And I believe it was normalized also thanks to ādāb. That is, Sufis were using prose and poetry that was profane, we would call it, and then they would reuse it in Sufi texts and manuals, and they would also inherit some emotion words that, even though non-Quranic, would still be in line with Quranic teachings, because we do have a sense of longing for God in the Quran. It's just not expressed by shawq. And going towards the end, as I hope has become clear from the preceding discussion, I argue that early Sufism can be understood as a complex emotional community or communities, or with sub-communities. One way communities cultivate a shared sense of belonging is through emotional hierarchies. How are you supposed to feel certain emotion if you are part of the elite, for instance? And Sufis were the elite, the spiritual elite. So in Sufi circles, emotions function as one strategy of differentiation, distinguishing practitioners from the religious common people. And you find many of these quotes trying to hierarchize emotions. So you have three dwellings in which the honest ones are active: the dwelling of fear of God, the dwelling of longing for the delights of paradise, but the highest is the dwelling of longing for God directly, loving him and remembering him. So this is something that we all know from Sufi literature, but it functions as, I argue, that it functions as an emotional strategy to differentiate Sufis from common believers. Not also, hierarchies brings oppositions. So Sufis will elaborate on this opposite pattern. The mutually exclusive kinds of longing will be emphasized and emblematized by emotional archetypes. So a very famous Sufi dream, Ibn Hanbal, and a famous pious mystic, Ma'ruf al-Karhi, are seen in paradise. The former stands at the gate of paradise and intercedes for the believers, while Ma'ruf enjoys God's vision. The former served the God out of longing for paradise and fear of hell, and the latter served God out of longing for God himself. So that's how you create, let's say, different emotional communities. I argue that emotional patterns represent an effective way to differentiate one movement from another. The growing Sufi community constantly depicted itself and was depicted in emotional terms precisely as the people of love and longing. Here you have love and longing. Al-ahl al-mahabba wa shawq, that surpassed the stage or overcame the stage of fear and hope, khawf wa raja. So this was also an emotional backbone that was understood as being an emotional backbone of Sufis, but not only by Sufis themselves, so intra-narratives, but also by the opponents of Sufism. So if we take, for instance, Ghulam Khalil, the famous persecutor of Sufis, he would also speak in these emotional terms, differentiating the two communities. He would say, know that the best worship of God is to fear God, to tread the path of awe, grief, anxiety, and timidity before him. Beware of those who advocate longing and love. So here you see they're like positing each other on two different emotional backbones. And this means, I called it, sorry, you cannot see, schismogenesis. So basically, because you create hierarchies, you divide people, and then your own identity is affirmed by opposition. And this is, I think, an interesting case by what we would call counterpunctual or country-wise emotional styles. So in this case, as Serraj, the Book of Flashes, of which I'm working on, a very first presentation of Sufism, he would say, my brother, be sincere with your companions while you mingle with the people of this world in this way. Be with them only outwardly, but dissociate from them with your acts and religion. But emotionally speaking, that's what you have to do. When they laugh, weep. When they're happy, be sad. So again, emotions as a different strategy of differentiation between the common believers and the Sufis. And the very last point that I would make is that another strategy is, as I said, one strategy is by opposition, and the other one is by reinforcing intra bonds. And how do you do that? You do it by stressing empathy, shafaqa, in particular, compassion also. And many of these Sufi manuals, and I believe this is an understudied emotion in general in Islam, shafaqa, not rahma, mercy, but compassion, is everywhere prescribed in this Sufi text. And for instance, this is a quote very, very well known in Sufi text by Al-Hasan al-Basri, and where we have this kind of sharing the emotion of the other, feeling with the other, especially if it's part of your community, of your emotional community. So for instance, if it's part of a Sufi tariqa or a Sufi community. The believer is a branch for the other believer. He tends to his needs and he shares his diseases. He rejoices of his joy. He grieves of his grief. He is the mirror of his brother. Emotional mirroring is actually a category nowadays, right? You will have a share of the destiny of your intimate friend, and you will have a share of whoever you said you love. What I've tentatively done with this overview of early Sufi emotions, or better, emotion words in their textual occurrences in Sufi text, is first to highlight their presence and relevance for our understanding of early Sufism. A reading of Sufism through emotions helps us to reconsider their fundamental role in shaping its intradynamics and interrelations in wayfaring the path. On a synchronic perspective, emotions are subtle markers of different authorial sensibilities and regional patterns and trends. On a diachronic perspective, Sufi feelings shed light on the formative period of Sufism, that is, how emotions were understood and interpreted over time, and possibly practiced by Sufis. Sufis emotionally distinguish themselves from other Islamic movements, forging their own way to feel and to feel Sufi. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Riccardo, very much.
I hope it stayed in the time.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great.
Now I'll pose a question or two, and then we'll open the discussion up to everybody else. So one thing that I was thinking about, and this I thought was a very excellent presentation, in as much as it both brings us into this very specific question of both synchronic and diachronic view of Sufi understanding of emotion, but also connects to very basic universal human experiences. But I was interested in this notion of truthfulness and the way that authors sort of sought to portray this with regard to themselves, or with regard to prescriptions for behavior, or in kind of evaluating one another within this kind of emotional community paradigm. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe if there's criteria or the way that kind of truthfulness was understood based on this. I think you mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation this notion that because of the kind of corpus that we have, we can know, we don't know what they felt. We know what they thought they ought to feel. We know, we have a different kind of layer that you know, or lens into the situation. But this idea of truthfulness yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk any about how this was conveyed, or how this was kind of understood, how one could be truthful in emotional expression and within this kind of framework of Sufism.
That's a question that tackles the core of the Sufi experience, the sidq, right? How you are truthful when you are a Sufi, when in your devotion practices, and also in emotions. And what is striking, and again, I believe a nice study would be surely on point, is the concept of truthfulness, but also in Sufi studies, the opposite, the concept of ostentation, riya, the concept of nifaq, so actually not being truthful. And Al-Muhasibi, for instance, has a whole book about it. So one of the first Sufis I mentioned, that is precisely tackling the fact that we cannot know the intention of the person. So we don't know if he's actually feeling sad because he's sad for what he really, for godly, let's say, purposes or divine purposes or not. And that's why he, in his book, he has this very lengthy and painstaking analysis of emotions to, let's say, I think they work like, yeah, like a written sheikh trying to challenge the reader, saying, are you really feeling what you're feeling egoless, without your ego, without your nafs? Or the intentionality of your emotion is not truthful. So they do discuss this very much. And the fact that we have so many, well, some works on ostentation and hypocrisy in the Sufi practice, but also in their emotional attitudes, shows that it was a main concern for the tariqah or for the community. Also, if we think about it, we have an interesting hadith that is, if you can't weep, pretend to weep, or that's the form that they use, or make yourself weeping, let's say. So this would go into emotional mimicry, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word in English, but mimicry, would you say that? Yeah. So sometimes our emotions are related, well, most of the time are related with our body, and therefore also practicing the emotion without having it, let's say, in our heart or feeling it completely, is also a way to train yourself to that particular emotion, right? And Sufis were aware of that, and they would, for instance, in the case of sadness, advise to, even though you were not truthful in that moment, right? But you were still trying to reach a certain truthfulness in that emotion. So it's indeed at the core of the Sufi quest of truthfulness and ostentation in divine worship. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating kind of set of questions that arises there, and I mean, it's particularly as you said at the beginning of your response, that sidq, the truthfulness, is such a crucial, fundamental concept, and so the way that this is expressed in behavior as well as you know, action as well as emotion is very interesting. And one other thing I wanted to ask, this is you know, also coming from the study of poetry or of Arabic poetry in general, within where you know, approaching Sufi poetry from that direction, we, as something you mentioned in the talk, was that some of these you know, in terms of vocabulary, non-Quranic vocabulary that comes from you know, or is also found in the poetic tradition, shawq, and other you know, emotional states and experiences. Yeah. Is so like, I guess for me it's, you know, so if I read, for example, a very famous case would be the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq of Ibn Arabi, the the Interpreter of Desires, a short collection of poems composed while he was living in Mecca, and there's a central beloved figure, this Nizam, that is a bit kind of shrouded in mystery. And so he's talking about her, he's longing for her, and yet, but this is only one layer of it. You know, so anyway, so coming at that from the study of poetry is that I'll read about the sadness, I'll read about longing, I'll read about ecstasy that he's discussing, and how, the sort of symbolic use, I guess, of emotion. I was wondering if you could talk, if your research has touched at all on poetry in particular as this kind of, I guess, additional layer of symbolism, or a different kind of, though related repertoire of symbols.
Yeah, once again at the core, thank you for this question, Nick. Again, once again at the core of the question, because I mean, poetry is shi'ar, feeling. So we are there. I mean, it's exactly the point. And also shawahid, right? The use that Sufis does of poetry as testimonies of what they're feeling or what they're experiencing. And yeah, for instance, you talked about the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq by Ibn Arabi, where there is a layer, of course, that is human, and then you have the divine layer, and he was forced, or possibly he wrote this commentary in order to explain this second layer. I believe what we see in the use of non-Quranic terms, for instance, but also in the reuse of poetry, let's call it profane poetry or secular poetry in Sufi text, is precisely this kind of sliding from the human emotions to the divine emotions. They are the same word, but then, of course, that's why we need to create mustalahat Sufiya, because we need to re-semanticize them, giving a new meaning to these words, and give them new intentionalities. So again, not only towards Nizam, for as beautiful as she is, but of course to the hikmah, latifa, with the subtle wisdom that Nizam actually represents, that comes from the Gharb and from the Sharq, this beautiful poetry of Ibn Arabi. So this would be, first of all, a certain slide between the human and the divine that usually the Sufis easily used, of course. And there was a second part of it, the use of poetry. Yeah, for instance, how do I imagine that Shawq would possibly be related to the fact that they would use so much this word because it came from poetry? Because if you took, for instance, Al-Kharghouchi's Manuals of Sufism, Tahdhib al-Azrar, so this important standardization of early Sufi teachings quite early in the history of Sufism, Bab al-Shawq, so the chapter on divine longing, is the chapter that contains most poetry. So this is also something that maybe let us believe, okay, this is possibly because they have such a repertoire and such a good emotional, let's say, such good emotional terms that they could use already available. And again, it's not in contrast with the Quranic topic. There is a seeking God's face and wanting to meet him, and Musa's parable on Sinai is there. So it's not contradicting it. I'm just using poetry in order to express that. And in the case of emotion, using poetry would be, I would say, the genre par excellence to do so. But unfortunately, and I have to admit it, given that dealing with Arabic pre-modern poetry is not that easy, I looked at the Sufi corpus. So when I would encounter poetry, I would dive into it, but I mostly focused on Sufi prose. So this painstaking analysis of these emotional states, and as I was saying, like a sheikh, I've written a sheikh that is kind of telling you, are you for sure that you're feeling this emotion because of that? What is your true intention behind this? So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Any questions?
Come around with a microphone. There we go. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, Riccardo. I have a question about embodiment of emotions. Do your texts talk about how feelings feel inside the body? Do they talk about feelings having locations in the body? And is there discussion of the body more broadly in these Sufi texts that you're working with?
Yes, thank you very much, Abigail, for this question. Yes, indeed. Well, I would say that in Sufi texts, they don't really go far away from what we would call a Sufi understanding of the body and their parts and their functions. So they're mostly in, what would be interesting is that they are at different levels, depending on where you feel it and which intentionality you feel it. So you have certain emotions that you feel at the level of the nafs, precisely because they're related to the ego. And then they are sublimized, I don't know if that's a word, sublimated, so thank you very much, sublimated towards the qalb. So they become, of course, more purer emotions. And so, again, I'm sorry I come back to sadness, but that was my specialization. But sadness for sins is related to what the nafs does, right? While a certain sadness for long, like a nostalgic sadness, that's at the level of the heart. So in this, let's say, the embodiment would be in these two parts. But then, of course, the emotional vocabulary in Arabic is all about the body, right? And when it's not about the body, it's about the nature. So, for instance, huzn, again, it's related to huzuna, which is like a rough terrain that it's hard to move on. It's obstacles. And batn and qabd, so this really like how the body is constricted and how it is relaxed. And for instance, a very important Sufi concept is inbisat, which is again related to bast, of course, but it's being, let's say, at ease with your Sufi disciple, with your Sufis muridun, so with your Sufis disciples, but also companions, let's say. Sorry, yeah. In the ādāb as-suhba from as-Sulami, for instance, you have this chapter on inbisat. So to feel at ease with other people. So really like to feel relaxed. And they also explain how then you can sit relaxed in that occasion and not, of course, for instance, when you do your prayer in front of God. So there is this very strong, let's say, relationship between emotion words, first of all, and the body. Some of them, like semantically, they really come back to the body. And then emotion words and this, let's say, bodily manifestation of them. So exactly, contraction, expansion. I'm sure there are many other examples right now. Well, yes, sorry. This would be Al-Hakim at-Tirmidhi again, and he would, for instance, conceptualize heavier emotions as hotter. So he would probably come back to Galen, and so we're in this domain, I guess. But again, heavier emotions are hotter, and their smoke that they produce, because they do produce a smoke that comes out from nafas, would be dark and negative in a way. And of course, the lighter emotion, or when they are sublimated, then they would produce a fragrant smell that would be impossible to conceal. And that's why, and that's an interesting point, Sufis would literally practice at-tanaffus bayna al-ikhwan. I don't know if you heard, this is in Ilm al-Qulub by Pseudo al-Makki. So breathing with each other, because it would mean that you were purified as much, and you were how do you say, expanding or giving a certain scent in the whole room, that would mean that you reached a certain high spiritual state. And that passed through also the purification of emotions. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Hi, thank you. Have you seen in your research specific emotions lost in time, maybe underemphasized, or at times certain emotions seem to be described more often, less often, or any like return to emotions, that specific emotions that may have lost like importance or just reference over time?
Yeah. This is a fascinating question. I unfortunately work with only the first 5 centuries of premodern Sufism, and I can't say that I found some lost emotions, which would be a very interesting endeavor. Try to see in the whole history of Sufis, for instance, if some emotion got lost or had a major revival. I unfortunately cannot answer to this because my chronology was very limited in a way. First century, very repetitive, somehow material. So no, I couldn't. But that's a fascinating question, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering because it seems like we could essentialize emotions or affect very easily, and in this way of, you know, addressing them spiritually. And I was wondering if you also thought about it as a, you know, sort of manifestations of social, political movements of the time, and you know, if you located any sort of revolutionary impulses or radical impulses in such, in such sort of developments.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's also, again, a very interesting question. I worked a little bit on the notion of ghadab, so anger, and shame, that were used as, political strategy, or I don't know, emotion used in political context. So basically, what we have is accounts of Sufis that were meeting the king or the sultan or the political authority, and that would use these emotions to downplay the ruler, for instance, to show that they were not afraid of him. So also the negotiation of fear, for instance, in front of the ruler, right? So I saw that, but they are anecdotal episodes. I couldn't say that, oh, this particular book has to do with these kinds of strategies related to political. Also because, I mean, especially early Sufi literature, first 5th century, they are very much, it's hard to find social, how do I say that, like social instances. Is all much more concentrated on the Sufi teachings as spirituality and so on. But again, there are some episodes in which they negotiate with power, and there the emotions are different, are mainly fear. So basically I show that I don't have fear of this ruler. Shame, I put the ruler into shame by moralizing, with using morality as the right criterion rather than power relationship. And then the third one would be anger. I show, as a Sufi, as we were reading there, I show anger because of disobedience, because I see some injustice, and I expose the ruler through my anger. I hope it answers a little bit to your question.
Thank you, Riccardo. Since I know nothing about Sufism, I will ask a more exotic question as I deal with fasaha and balagha. Have you perhaps by any chance noticed in the text that you have surveyed that the authors resort to any linguistic device, and in particular rhetorical device, such to introduce the emotions in the text, such as metaphor or isti'ara or other kind of rhetorical forms?
Sure, So metaphors, they are everywhere when talking about emotions. And that's also why sometimes they can escape, right, the eye, because you cannot, again, if you use these digital humanities tools, it's great because you can see where Hosn is. But then what about paraphrases or a metaphor of this emotion or this feeling? So for instance, there is this scene in one of the manuals of the Sufi looking down on earth, playing with the sand and reflecting about a certain fitna. And this, of course, is not, you don't have any emotion word, but it's clearly like a scene of sorrowfulness or sadness. But yeah, more specific, like rhetorical figure, I'm not sure. I mean, they really would go quite straightforward. Perhaps what they have, as we were talking before in the question with Abigail, is let's say manifestations of emotions rather than the emotion itself. So weeping for sadness and this, how would you call it, this excitement related to, and this red skin for instance, shauq, longing, or anger, blackness in certain cases. So, but you wouldn't have much rhetorical, other instruments to introduce emotion. I would say they're also very, straightforward text, most of them at least. Yeah.
One other thing that just occurred to me out of curiosity is, kind of across the corpus that you've been working with, were there any particular emotions, positive, desirable, virtuous ones, or less virtuous ones that were sort of regarded as the, was there any particular one that was regarded as the most difficult to cultivate or the most difficult to kind of keep under control?
Wow. I'll have to think about it. So let's say immediately it doesn't come to mind a certain emotion in particular. Perhaps no, because most difficult to tame, I would say they would, yeah, they are often talking about emotion as a group, as you said, things. So they're all together in a way. So taming the nafs would be the most difficult things to do, but then these let's say, interest different emotions, right? Perhaps one that is, again, I'm sorry, I come back to that, but it struck my attention. Again, shauq, in a way, it's very interesting because from one side is extremely positive, right? It's going towards God's proximity. But on the other side is debated, is it inferior or superior to love? Because shauq at the end of the day is a movement, haraka, while mahabba is more stationary. But the problem is that the Sufi that believes that he has arrived, he has failed, because he believes that he has arrived. That's not correct. So shauq becomes, in a way, a gift that you feel this longing for God. And on the same time, is a bala, is a trial, because it's never ending. So it's, I mean, here we are in the core of mysticism, right? It's a spiral movement that never ends and continues to repeat itself without stopping. So that's why I believe shauq could be a good candidate for an extremely difficult emotion to tame or to understand, because at times can be very frustrating and at times can be a gift of proximity to God. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much for the questions. Thank you again, Riccardo.
Thank you very much.
We will have a reception out in the lobby for anyone interested. Thank you all again very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually,
We can see if you want to do sitting or standing over here.
Sitting is fine.